Well, it's natural and healthy to have friends, or it was, just as it's natural and healthy to have a single favorite friend. That's what you thought. But something being natural and healthy doesn't mean that somebody won't find a way to ban it. In a recent article, psychologist Barbara Greenberg endorsed efforts by schools in this country and in Europe to abolish best friends. You can never make it up. She says the existence of best friends is exclusionary, which of course is true by definition, and causes emotional distress. Nell Daly is a psychotherapist, and she joins us tonight. Nell, thanks for coming on.
Hi, thank you, Tucker. Thanks for having me.
So this is what I want to take this seriously, because the things that you laugh at are the things that become federal law, before you know it.
Right.
But having a best friend is by definition exclusionary, right? You're choosing one among many, but that doesn't make it bad. I mean, marriage is also exclusionary unless it's plural marriage, and that's not bad either. So exclusionary isn't always bad. Why is having a best friend bad?
Well, I think what's happening in the trend across America, both in public and private schools and in Europe and in Canada, is that many schools are starting to adopt or mandate that children have certain behaviors in schools, certain policies, behavioral policies, for lack of a better word. And it's meant to teach kids to be polite to one another. It's meant to teach manners. It's meant to encourage diversity and tolerance. And the people who are against this kind of best friend policy are people who believe that it's not teaching children how to deal with negative social anxiety. Right. The negative feelings that children would feel if they are excluded. I think the magic place here is actually someplace in the middle.
Well, why wouldn't the magic place just stay out of it and kind of teach like English and history and math?
I totally hear what you're saying. Many schools now have a no tolerance to bullying policy on their books. Right. I mean, both public and private schools. So it's a way to encourage children to be nice to each other. It's a way to encourage manners, for lack of a better word.
I'm totally for that. But isn't, I wonder, let me just say I'm totally for that. I'm completely for tolerance and good manners.
Yeah,
I have no idea what diversity means,
anybody's for compassion and kindness.
Sure, but it doesn't seem like it is a form of insidious social control to try and tell other people who to be friends with. I mean, who would want to tell someone who to be friends with in the first place? Do you think it's a little weird?
Well, I think what's happening, I don't necessarily think they're telling kids which friends they can have and which they can't. They're encouraging kids to have larger friend groups. The problem with it is that the University of Virginia did a study where they found, and they published this in Child Development, which they found that kids who did have best friends grew up to have higher rates of more positive mental health as they became adults. Yeah. And they also had less social anxiety. So that's the argument against this sort of behavioral policy that a lot of schools are mandating. We need to teach children to deal with negative feelings, right? If we numb the dark, we also numb the light. But we also need to teach children that everyone belongs. You don't want to make any child ever feel unworthy or give them a sense of unbelonging in any kind of community. So I think that there's both.
I guess. I mean, I'm totally opposed to meanness and bullying, obviously.
Yeah.
And I mean that.
Yeah, of course.
But I also think these issues are enormously complex, and the kind of people who teach school probably not equipped to handle these issues better than, say, the parents of the child. And I guess as a parent, I resent the idea that someone I hired to teach my kids facts is intruding into really personal questions like who you're friends with or how many friends you have. Like, why don't they stay out of that stuff completely?
Well, I wish that all kids didn't have any sort of behavioral issues in schools, but as someone who's worked in the school system, kids do. So oftentimes teachers are put in the position of having to help children learn how to modify and control their behavior. So they do have certain policies on the books, like you can't just have a bully running rampant in your elementary school.
But I mean, having a best friend is not the same as, I mean, let's not conflate the terms. It's not the same. If you really want to spend all your time with one person, that's not the same as bullying other people. What would be the remedy? Telling a kid you have to have more friends, or how would you fix something like this?
I think that they're trying to avoid children having cliques. So what they do is they try to get children to play with larger groups of kids and sort of run in larger packs with each other. The thing that's really interesting here is that we can have this in schools, and then at home we can definitely encourage kids, and we should encourage kids to have really close interpersonal relationships with each other. Not only is it good for their health, but as you said, I think it models a healthy family unit moving forward as well.
Yeah. Last question, really quick. It used to be you
sure.
kind of taught the kids in the classroom, and then you sort of let them go outside, and as long as there was no gunfire, you kind of didn't get involved. Why was that a bad idea, that model?
I don't think it was a bad idea, but I think that times have changed. And the reality is that I live in a community that's not so far from Newtown. So unfortunately, you know, bad things happen in the world when kids start to feel socially excluded. And so we have to worry about that as educators.
Right,
I mean,
but those things didn't actually
violence does happen in school.
when weird middle-aged adults didn't get involved in the personal lives of kids. We had less, you know, events like that. I mean, I don't know if there's a connection or not. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah,
no, thank you.
I understand your point completely. No, thank you, Tucker. It's a pleasure.
Good to see you. Well, for all of our lives, we've lived in a world of boys and girls, but that is changing along with everything else in 2017. In Canada, the country directly to our north, the parents of a baby successfully petitioned to have that child given an ID card with no sex listed, insisting that that is for the baby to decide. Things may not stop there. They probably won't. The Gender Free ID Coalition is calling on the Canadian government to eliminate sex and gender classifications for all children throughout that country. Are we ready for a world here where baby boys and girls are replaced by baby somethings? Nell Gibbon-Daly is a psychotherapist, and she joins us tonight. Nell, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you so much, Tucker, for having me. It's a pleasure.
So these are questions that didn't exist like 18 months ago. Homo sapiens have been around 300,000 years, and for the most part, it was kind of obvious who the boys and girls were. But we've decided in a very short period of time that none of that is real, and we're changing it, because why?
Well, to be honest with you, we believe that people who are considered intersex, people who are born with both sets of genitalia, have existed throughout human history.
For sure.
So the federal government just released a study in 2016 that 1.4 million people now identify themselves as transgendered, and Canada isn't the only place that's doing this. Legislation was just introduced in Washington, D.C. and in New York over the past couple of months to also have parents have the right to, on a child's birth certificate, not just say that the child is male or female, but also X or unidentified.
But I think you may be conflating two things.
Sure.
So the number of intersex births in this country, that is where a child has both sets, partially or fully formed, of genitalia, is maybe a little over 700 per year out of about 4 million births. So it's less than 1/10 of 1%. So very small numbers, tiny number. Okay.
You know, sorry, Tucker.
And probably we can assume that's been consistent through time. But and nobody is suggesting that, you know, you force a sex onto a child whose sex is not clear. But for most kids, overwhelming number of kids, it is clear. So why should we pretend it's not clear? I guess that's the question. I
think it's a great question. I mean, as to your statistic, I had trouble finding accurate numbers as to how many children are born in this country who are intersex.
Right.
I got numbers that say 1 out of every 1,500 births, also 1 out of every 100 births, where there is some sort of either anomaly.
Hold on. 1 out of every 100 births has there is separate sets of genitalia.
Well,
I don't think that's right.
It doesn't have to go that far. So there could be some sort of like genetic, I don't want to say abnormality, but an anomaly, right? Like a chromosomal anomaly, that it's not so clear, meaning that gender is not necessarily based on genitalia. And so I think your other question, though, is should we give people the right to say we're going to raise a child as non-binary, meaning we're not going to raise a child as male or female, which is something that the couple in Canada is
right, because
doing.
I mean there are legitimate, I think, medical situations, and you've just described some of them where, you know, it's an open question, and I would never deny that, and of course you want to respond compassionately. But that's not what this case is about. This case is about the idea that you get to choose what your sex is, which is a denial of biology. And there's also, and I think as a psychotherapist you'd agree, a cost to a child. If you say to a little kid, you know, I don't know if you're male or female, you decide, I don't think you're going to get a good outcome a lot of the time at all. that's why people have never done that through human history.
You know what? The couple that is, or the person who's deciding to do this with their child up in Canada, the point, I spoke to them on the phone, the point that they are making is that this child is a spiritual being having a human experience, not a human being having a spiritual experience. So it's actually a very spiritual endeavor. And what it's saying is that let's just let the child be a child, and eventually the child will decide what it wants to be, how much it wants to identify as a boy or how much it wants to identify as a girl. And this person is also saying that it's not that I'm not going to raise a child as a girl or a boy. I'm just going to say to the child, you just be a child, just be an individual for a while. Let's not have the government interfere with who you are. Let's not put a set of preconceived notions about who you are onto you. Let's just let you develop as a human being, and eventually you can decide whether or not you want to be a boy or girl or non-binary.
Yeah, but you can't actually decide. And I'm for choice, and there are a lot of biological realities that I'm sad about, that I would change about no, I'm sincere, that I would change about myself. And so I'm not attacking anybody, but don't you think that biological reality matters, and lying to kids and telling them, you know, actually you could be 6'7", or you could have blue eyes instead of brown, or whatever. I mean, those are lies, and it's never a good idea to lie to kids, is it?
I don't think it's a lie. I think it's actually giving children more information at a younger age than we traditionally have, right? So it's like, I'm going to give a comparison. It's like raising a child to not assume that they're heterosexual. Right, the way I've raised my children is to say, like, I don't know what they're going to be, and I'm not just going to assume that they're gay or they're straight. I just give them lots of information, expose them to lots of people.
But there's a difference here, because whereas, you know, we don't know a lot about the biology of homosexuality, we know a lot about the biology of sex, because we know that it begins on the chromosomal level. Like, there's a science piece to this that's being ignored by people who I thought believed in science. So that's why I'm a little bit confused.
I don't think it's being ignored. I think what we're seeing, though, in the federal study and what's come out in terms of the Census Bureau is that if 1.4 million people don't identify with the gender marker that they were given at birth, we have to take note of that and say what's going on, that there's a fluidity about gender, and it's not necessarily rooted in biology.
Why does that not extend to race?
Tell me what you mean by that. You're going to have to explain that one to me.
If I can say I'm a woman, why can't I say I'm a Chinese woman and be taken every bit as seriously? And I'm not mocking you. I'm making a sincere point, and it's a sincere question. What's the difference?
You know, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think as we progress as a society, some of these labels that we're putting on things, and I can't necessarily go to the race question, although one of the things that I've loved about your program as of late is that you're really into this idea of having a more inclusive society and being less separatist in terms of race, that we should be more inclusive. And I think that that's what we're saying. We're creating a space at the table for people to be, to have optionality in terms of how they want to identify themselves.
Okay. Well, as long as we're still science-based, then, you know, as a child legal
argument, it's not taking science off the table. It's just saying, can we look at it from another perspective?
Okay. Now, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Tucker.